Hi, I'm Charlotte Yates, host of the interview series Women Talking Democracy. Today, I have the pleasure of chatting with Ewa Krajewska, who is a partner and co-chair of the Civil Litigation Practice Group at Henein Hutchison Robitaille LLP. She specializes in a wide range of legal fields, most importantly, perhaps for our interview today, in public and administrative law, constitutional and regulatory disputes, and appellate advocacy, which involves challenging or defending court decisions in higher courts. Ms. Krajewska had the privilege of clerking for the Chief Honourable Justice Rosalia Bella of the Supreme Court of Canada. During her legal career, Ms. Krajewska has argued some major court cases with significance to our parliamentary democracy. In particular, I would note that she was Chief Counsel for the Civil Liberties Association of Canada in their 2022 challenge to the federal government's use of the Emergencies Act in response to the trucker convoy protest. This case was watched by thousands of Canadians across the country, and it generated a lot of heated discussion about the limits of free speech and the protection of individual rights, two subjects critical to any democracy. Through this case, Ms. Krajewska had the rare privilege of cross-examining a sitting Prime Minister, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. At the time, Ms. Krajewska was quoted as saying, "It's a lot of fun to litigate these hard, new, complex issues and propose to the court the right way of interpreting the factual record." Welcome, Ms. Krajewska, to our studio and to the Women Talking Democracy series. So let's start with a couple of questions about you, your journey, your choices, kind of what's motivated you. You're a lawyer of a very particular sort, a specialist in constitutional law and procedural law. And so tell us, what made you choose law as your profession and why this area of law?
Sure. So if I can, I'm going to go back a little bit.
Please do.
Because I think my background sort of informs my choices and my perspective on a lot of these issues. So I was born in Poland when Poland was under martial law after it had done something that the communist Russian government disagreed with. My mom was worried about going into labor at night because there was a curfew, and she was worried that she wouldn't be able to get to the hospital. And my parents immigrated to Canada in 1986 with me, thinking the Berlin Wall wouldn't fall for another 100 years. And it did 3 years later. And so, issues of authoritarianism, questions of things are always the way they are and they will never change, politics as being always stable, have always kind of been omnipresent in my life. We always talked politics at home. We talked about politics in Canada, politics in Europe. I used to watch with my dad NPR's The McNeil-Lehrer News Hour. And so I think it really drove me to look for a career where I felt like I can, in very simple terms, make a difference. Where politics and public policy and solving complex problems are sort of my day-to-day life, and it's sort of always driven me.
So interesting. So given it's interesting, your area of law, when one reads a description, might think of it as dry, but it's often very controversial, as we'll talk about in a few minutes. Given it's controversial in a world where there is more controversy, more polarization, what keeps you kind of steady, getting up in the morning, keeping you motivated, driven by those same values and goals, when it's easy to get knocked off your perch, if you will, by circumstances surrounding us in the world?
Right. Well, I think if you're going to be doing constitutional law, the issues that get litigated are not the simple ones. They're often the controversial ones. And you have to be willing to face adversity on those issues. I feel very proud that I work at a law firm where I feel very supported by the people that I work with, where if I want to take on a hard mandate, I get support to do it, but also where, disagreement and intellectual rigor and intellectual curiosity are valued. And I think those intangibles, being able to be intellectual about issues, debating issues, talking about hard issues, they're all foundational to democracy.
Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, it's part of the reason we have these conversations is because democracy is very much about those different opinions, those different views, and so on. So democratic systems of government have been considered the gold standard in the world for probably 80 years, almost. I mean, by the end of World War II, really became the gold standard. And what do you think sustained that? And again, your experience being born with your parents in Poland means your perspective perhaps might be shaped by that. But what do you think made it the gold standard for so many people, not just countries, but people striving for democracy?
Well, I think democracy allows people to, in its most purest form, self-actualize. It allows people to make choices for themselves as to how they see themselves living a good life, whether it's freedom of religion choices, freedom of who they marry choices, and how and where they work. And in authoritarian regimes, those choices are often made for you by somebody else. And so I think the aspiration of democracy, and a liberal democracy, is the ability to make choices for yourself. I think what has sort of sustained that, in part, and I'll talk a little about economics and political science, and I'll draw to my expertise in law. But I think what in part sustained that after the Second World War was actually the threat of communism. And I sort of take this thesis from a poli-sci professor in Bulgaria, named Ivan Krastev, who talks about how the threat of communism meant that Western capitalist societies had to, show that their system was better, that it was more attractive. So they had to make the economics of it work, and they had to make democracy work. And he would say they also had to be there had to be economic redistribution. You could not have great disparities of wealth in the Western world because you always had this threat of communism. And so you had to, take what the working class was asking for seriously. I think the fact that communism left or was defeated in 1991 and you don't have this existential threat anymore means that you don't necessarily see democracy as, I think, as a shining light in the same way. But I think, turning back to the law, I think some of the things that sustained democracy over the last 80 years has also been the development of constitutional democracy. So the fact that we have a Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms in Canada, where the protection of minorities is protected. In Europe, you have the development of the Human Rights Tribunal in Europe. So you can't just think of, I think, of democracy as something, as a standalone right to vote. I think you have to look at it as being supported by other institutions. And in the league, other than economics, which I think are also very important, but in my world, the idea of constitutional democracy is very important.
So tell me a little bit about what you mean by constitutional democracy, because I think for people listening, they may think, liberal democracy, yes, we understand. What do you mean by a constitutional democracy?
So I think what I mean by a constitutional democracy is you could see democracy in a very simple terms as majority rules, right? We elected this government, we had more votes than others. Whatever laws that government passes should be legitimate and should be accepted. And it doesn't matter that the majority has now passed a law that says we're all going to be Catholic. Or it doesn't matter that the majority passes a law that says you can't have gay marriage anymore, right? So there is a form of illiberal democracy where you don't protect the rights of others or minorities, right? So to me, a constitutional democracy is one where we have decided that there are, what the Western world calls inalienable rights, the right to freedom of conscience, the right to freedom of religion, other rights that protect us in the criminal justice system, equality, and those rights exist. And even if a majority of elected representatives passes a law, it's not sufficient. That law has to also be consistent with constitutional rights.
In other words, they can't immediately overturn the rights that were embedded and have been embedded for decades, for example. Interesting, and particularly, I think, interesting at this moment in time to be talking about this. And we could go in all kinds of directions in Canada with regards to protection of human rights, democracy, and so on, because it is something that's been very important, I think, for us in Canada. If we think now, if you talk about democracies, and yet there was a recent study in the United States, actually it's an international study, saying there are now more autocracies than democracies in the world. And this follows a period when, to be honest with you, when the book The End of History was written, it was written because it looked like democracy had won, liberal democracy had won. As you said at your opening, communism was defeated and a liberal democracy won. Now we seem to have moved towards embrace, or many countries have, and many people have, to more authoritarian systems. So perhaps the first is, why is democracy in decline, do you think? And what's changed in the last few years to undermine it?
Right. Well, I think there have been several changes that have led to a decline in democracy. The first is, I think this fight between the Western world and the communist world is a factor. You don't have, people championing democracy in contrast to another system that's very obvious and that's competing with it, and where you have very stringent lines drawn. I think that's one factor. I think the other factor is, I think we have, as a result or as a symptom, we have become less liberal, or we've become more illiberal. And I think that has happened both on the left side of the political spectrum and the right side of the political spectrum. I think on the right, you see it with this illiberal democracy, these populist movements that really do, I think, embrace more of a majoritarian rule outlook on life. If the majority elects somebody and they decide that we no longer like immigrants, that's fine. That's the policy. We're sort of pulling away from a constitutional democracy. And then I think on the left, we have had the development of an intolerance of viewpoints that we disagree with. And so I think it was probably a mistake to equate words or speech with violence. I think that led to censorship. I think it led to an us versus them kind of mentality around speech. And I think it also led, very unfortunately, to leaders in our world, professionals, including lawyers and academics, from censoring themselves, or a chilling effect on them being able to speak out. So, when we talk about democracy and the self-actualization, you need to be able to be informed to self-actualize. You need access to an independent media. You need access to information. And if you're telling professionals, if you're telling lawyers, doctors, psychologists, academics, if you state this opinion, I'm going to try to fire you. I'm going to write to your college. I'm going to write to your dean. I'm going to write to the bar society. If you do that, these leaders, who I think are pillars of democracy, are going to disengage. And I think that is going to impoverish our democracy, because then you're left with what? The majority rules problem again.
Interesting, and it's also an interesting development from majority rule, which perhaps in the very early days of democracy, it may have been more majority rules, and then we moved away from that towards the constitutional democracy, and now back towards that majority, but also with the erosion of many of the pillars of democracy that you've kind of talked about. So what do you think, if you look around, what do you think are you've identified many threats to democracy. Is there a particular one that you think is the greatest threat to democracy, or do you think it's the assault on all of those pillars that begins to undermine it?
Well, I think it's the assault on all of those pillars. And look, we only have to look at what is happening in the United States. I think the pillars of democracy, other than, let's just step back. What do we see as the pillars of democracy? So you have free and fair elections, and you have, but to support that, I don't think that's necessary but not sufficient to have a democracy. What do you need in addition to that? An independent media, universities, and an independent judiciary and independent bar. And if we look at what's been happening in the United States, President Trump has attacked all three of those pillars systematically through executive orders, through actions. All of those pillars of democracy have been under attack, and this also happened in Hungary, it happened in the UK, it happened in Poland, it happened in Nazi Germany. You go after the media, you discredit the media, you go after the lawyers and the judges, you discredit the judges, and you go after the academic institutions who also have the freedom to say and to speak out on issues. And if you do that, you are severely weakening democracy.
And I think that what's important about that is, as you've suggested, it's happening in many, many places around the world. And then that also has its own it builds a kind of momentum, if you will. What role can lawyers play in resisting that? Because when we look around the world, I think it's academics, as you've said, lawyers, have often remained silent in the face of those attacks. How can and what can lawyers and the judiciary do to uphold? How do you withstand those kind of attacks? Because that's a really core question to what's happening now.
Right. And so, I think I'll start with, why is it so important to have an independent judiciary and an independent bar? And in my view, they're you need to have those in order to have a constitutional democracy. Because if a law is passed by majority rule and you want to challenge that law, you need to do it in front of a judge who's going to be independent. And you often need to retain lawyers in order to bring the case. And independent judiciary requires security of tenure, which we have in Canada. It also requires independence of from the administration of the state. So often they have security of funding and an independent remuneration process. So we've put all those pillars in place in Canada for judges. And an independent bar means that lawyers are able to act for clients without fears of threats or retaliation. And in the UK, when the government was trying to reduce the number of immigrants, they were accusing lawyers of being activist lawyers who were preventing the government for acting on this, on these briefs. And I want to just mention, you know, when the government, when authoritarian regimes or regimes that are trying to secure their authority, they don't go about taking away the autonomy of lawyers by like nationalizing a bar association, right? It's not necessarily this like brute action. What they do instead is they delegitimize the role that lawyers play. And so I want to read from a few of the executive orders that President Trump issued against law firms, because they're really quite telling. So the one against Perkins Coie starts off with Section 1, purpose. The dishonest and dangerous activity of the law firm Perkins Coie has affected this country for decades. It's shocking.
It is shocking.
And the one against Paul Weiss, Section 1, background. Global law firms have for years played an outsized role in undermining the judicial process and in the destruction of bedrock American principles. Many have engaged in activities that make our communities less safe, increase burdens on local businesses, limit constitutional freedoms, and degrade the quality of American elections. So it's not nationalizing the bar, it's not preventing access to the courts, it's delegitimizing the role that lawyers play in society. And you see this as well in delegitimizing the role of judges. When a government is unhappy with a judicial decision, be very wary when governments criticize judicial decisions around parole, around sentencing. Governments will say stuff like, well, the judges are on the side of the criminals, or they're making our streets unsafe, right? They align the judges or the lawyers with the enemy, as aiding the enemy. And it's very dangerous because it is the role of lawyers and judges to be a check on this majority rule. And if you don't have access to that, if you don't have access to lawyers who are able to act freely for their clients without fear of retaliation, you're not going to have challenges to these government actions. You're not going to have a constitutional democracy.
And of course, you then have no means as well to protect the rights of those individuals in the face of attacks on them as well.
Exactly.
So, such an important part of our democracy that I think we often didn't think critically about when things were sailing along well. And now, I think we're being forced to think really seriously about the points you made, but also why it is that our judiciary and our lawyers seem to be able to be more independent than they are in some other countries, and what is it about the systems here that reinforce those, at least our countervailing weights, if you will, on governments that seek to, as you say, demonize. And I think that demonization also can happen with, as you've suggested, with academics, with other political parties, and it feeds into your whole notion that there is this kind of illiberalism, this lack of dialogue as well that goes along with that. So if I turn now to my the particular interest of this series is around women,
yes.
Talking about democracy. And there's a couple of paradoxes about women and democracy. And one of them is, if we look around the world, women's progress in society, women's advancement, seems to be scaffolded on the expansion of human rights, ergo with expansion of democracies, with that constitutional democracy, with rights. Therefore, women's success and ability to move into various areas is opened by those changes. At the same time, does that mean women are essentially, is democracy a key part of women's advancement?
So,
and I have a follow-up question to this, but I do want to just start there, and then we'll talk a little bit about women and authoritarianism.
Right. Well, I think it's complicated because, you know, if you look at communist countries, they had great participation by women in the workforce,
Yes.
right? And they had all these propaganda about how great their women are doing in the workforce. But it was still a fundamentally patriarchal society. Women worked in the workforce and then they did all the labor at home and all the home rearing and all the cooking and everything else. So, you know, like, it depends on what are you really trying to study? Like women's advancement, women's fulfillment, women's presence. I think women are present in the workforce in authoritarian and democratic regimes. But I think if you're looking at self-actualization, if you're looking at change, if you're looking at impact, then I think women's participation is crucial in a democracy. And maybe this is just a small example, but I think it's impactful. The first judge on the Supreme Court of Canada who was a woman was Justice Bertha Wilson.
Yes.
And she penned two very important decisions. One of them is R.V. Morgentaler, which is the decision on abortion. Yes. In Canada. And I will read a line from her decision because I don't think this line would exist in a judgment if it were not for her presence on the court. She writes, "It is probably impossible for a man to respond, even imaginatively, to the dilemma of an unwanted pregnancy, not just because it is outside of the realm of his personal experience, although this is, of course, the case, but because he can relate to it only by objectifying it, thereby eliminating the subjective elements of the female psyche which are at the heart of the dilemma."
Wow, what an incredible statement. And when was that written?
1985.
Like that's 30, 40 years ago.
30, 40 years ago.
That's
but
pretty
you would
remarkable.
not have that statement. Like she is, pointing at the issue. In law, we have this tendency to always abstract everything, right? Morgentaler was about procedural rights and fairness and, all these very technical terms of abstracted the issue. And here she is being like, no. Like, this is the issue. Like, here it is on a very fundamental human level that no one else is willing to say out loud. And she's able to do that because she's a woman on the court functioning in a constitutional democracy. And so I think this, that is a difference that I think that democracies have, where they promote women and put women in places of power, whereas autocracies would not have that. I don't think you would have her write that. And she also was sort of instrumental in another judgment that year called Lavallee, which was on battered women syndrome and the defense that women could advance if they were beaten by their husbands. And she wrote, "It is not for the jury to pass judgment on the fact that an accused battered woman stayed in the relationship. Still less is it entitled to conclude that she forfeited her right to self-defense for having done so." Like, very powerful.
Powerful and remarkable for the period in which they were, because they are still so relevant today.
So relevant today.
So relevant today. In fact, sometimes I would say as relevant, if not more so, as we see the encroachment on women's rights in so many places around the world. Also, a very interesting distinction you make between communist regimes and democracies, because I think if you think about Russia at various points, education, women were physicists, astronauts. In other words, places where women in Canada and the United States were not. But I think it is an important difference is what are we looking at when we unpack the importance of women in democracy. So that then raises for me, we're now in a period where I think we're seeing, and perhaps we've always seen this, there are a higher number of high-profile leaders of authoritarian parties who are women. Mm-hmm. And you see a return in some cases, in some parts of the world, to more traditional roles for women, or at least some women advocating for that. What do you think, how do we reconcile ourselves with that? And that, I don't truly know the answer, but it is a puzzle, given what women achieve under democracy.
I think it's, I don't think we can always assume that every woman leader will be a feminist, just in the same way we can't assume that men don't promote women or men don't sponsor women. I think some of it is trying always, I think, many people who go into to politics and public policy do so in good faith. They are trying to conjure up, what does the good life look like? And maybe for some, the good life does look like a much more traditional gendered role. I think, to me, the real question is, well, why would you impose that on everybody? Why would you say that that's the only possibility? Why would you not try to create a democracy or an economic situation where women can make those choices properly? Quebec has, in a way, because they were one of the first provinces to really create an opportunity for universal childcare, they have the highest rates of women participating in the workforce as a result. That's
Exactly.
Quite remarkable.
Yes, it is remarkable.
Yeah.
And similarly in France, where for many, many reasons, France very early on introduced schooling for children as young as 3, and it also increased the women's participation in the labor force. So very interesting examples. So if we think about the challenges faced by democracy, and I think you've laid out some of them, what is your prognosis for democracy? I think we're sitting here now and there's a lot of people who feel it's failed them. People often are angry. They feel that democracy has not delivered what it said it would. At the same time, there are many who support democracy but are not quite sure what that future looks like. What's your prognosis for democracy?
Well, I think the alarm bells that democracy is under threat have finally gotten loud enough. So I think more people are really paying attention to what is it that we need to make a democracy truly function. And I think we have to, I think there's two things. I think we need to be, and it's difficult, we need to be much more committed to our liberal principles and to be able to properly defend why is it important for freedom of expression to be almost unbounded? Why is it important for lawyers to be able to act for clients and defend clients? Why is it important that we don't have regulators take away people's licenses because of the stuff that they say? Why do we have to be, and it's hard because I don't like it when people say things that I think are wrong and dangerous and are going to maybe lead to more authoritarianism. But the reaction, the knee-jerk reaction to just tell them to stop is not the right answer. I think the other part that I think we need to really work through is that democracy does not, again, it needs to be nourished from other institutions. I think that the frustration that people feel with democracy is really, to my mind, a frustration with a lack of economic redistribution and economic well-being. We've seen the gap between the wealthy and the poor increase so much over the last 20 years, and people feeling like they're not making headway. And it's not because they're not making headway in a democracy, it's because they're not making headway economically. I think we have seen, unfortunately, the death of an independent media. And we have social media and we have the creation of echo chambers. And I'm not sure we've really figured out how to resolve that. No one is watching Peter Mansbridge every night anymore. That's not what's happening. People are receiving a very, their own personal news feed that they have curated in the way that they want to see it.
So I'm going to then move a little bit from there to your own role in, because if we think about what the prognosis for democracy, what your role is in preserving democracy, you took on a very, very difficult case for the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. You was their lead lawyer in challenging the introduction of the Emergencies Act in response to the convoy that occupied Ottawa for several weeks. That case was watched very, very closely by thousands of Canadians, highly polarizing in terms of the debate around that. And so you step in the middle of that, if you will. Tell me a little bit about why, but also how that relates to defending democracy, because I think those two are linked. So
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
So, I mean, part of this, during the pandemic, I kind of became very fascinated and sort of addicted to watching the emergency orders, like watching all the different public health orders, watching all the different emergency orders issued by different levels of government. I sort of became an expert in these things and was advising clients on a lot of these issues. And I was very, very much in favor of public health measures. You know, I was reading all of it, and I thought this was what we needed to do at the time. And then when the Freedom Convoy happened in Ottawa, the CCLA called me and said, you know, we think this is an overstep. And I know you've been doing all this work on emergency orders, you've spoken about it, would you take this on? And, again, I spoke to my partners and they said, like, yes, this is like a really important issue. And many people were a little surprised that I did this because they saw me on Twitter as being very much an advocate for public health orders. And
so they couldn't square those two.
They couldn't square Ewa as me personally and Ewa as the lawyer. But that is also very important to democracy. Like, lawyers as professionals, you should not just take on cases that you always agree with. You have to take on cases where you might not disagree with, that you may disagree with, but also, like, to me, it was a very important legal issue. Like, it's fundamental to our society. When can the federal government invoke the Emergencies Act? Because what the Emergencies Act does means that the federal government no longer has to pass laws in Parliament. It can just do it at the executive table by cabinet and pass laws that apply to all of Canada and usurp provincial laws. And so, it's basically giving itself all the power for that period of time. And so it's very important to me to say, like, when is the threshold met? When is there such a significant threat to the safety and security of Canada that the federal government can give itself all of this power to be able to respond to the threat? And it didn't mean that I agreed with what the Freedom Convoy was saying. But that is exactly what the importance of the role of lawyers is. The role of lawyers is to be able to bring the important issues to the court, to have it properly adjudicated by an independent judiciary so that we have answers to these questions. Because one of the wonderful things about the common law in our system is that it's supposed to give us predictability. Right? Authoritarianism thrives on arbitrariness and unpredictability because it creates fear. You don't know if you do this, you're going to be in trouble. What the common law does is supposed to give us certainty and predictability in terms of if you follow the rules, these are supposed to be the outcomes. That's one of the safeties that we have. And so it's a very important case. I think what I was surprised by is that I was representing the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. There were other associations that were involved in the challenge, but there weren't any for lack of a better word, left-leaning or progressive organizations environmental organizations, other organizations that also stepped forward with the challenge, probably because they didn't agree with the people at the Freedom Convoy. But the problem is, if the threshold for invoking this act is set too low, then next time it's not going to be invoked against the people you dislike. It's going to be invoked against the people that you like. It's going to be invoked against the indigenous protesters at a pipeline. It's going to be invoked against the environmental protesters. Going back to this idea, we have to be so committed to our principles, right? Our principles of liberalism. And we can't fall into this false safety that we should only defend the liberalism on the issues that we like. We have to defend it for everybody.
And that example is so interesting because we have seen in places that we would say are democracies where they have begun to encroach on those rights to protest, but still it must have been at times difficult to take on that case. But also interesting because the other side of the accountability, if you will, or at least what I see as partly holding governments as well to account, was you were able to cross-examine the Prime Minister, the sitting Prime Minister at the time. And that must have been both an interesting and a kind of a special experience, but also it speaks to something about democracy, does it not?
It does. So I will say a few things that I think worked very well. Well, first of all, in Canada, if the government invokes the Emergencies Act, it has to justify it in three ways. It has to justify it in front of Parliament. It then has to hold a public commission to explain why it did that, and it has to be able to explain it to the courts. So we have these accountability mechanisms. And the Prime Minister Trudeau at the time, agreed to this commission, waived cabinet confidences, which is huge with respect to all the information that his cabinet received in deciding to invoke the act. And that gave Canadians a huge amount of transparency that you would otherwise not have. And he had his ministers, many of his ministers and himself, appear at the commission and be examined. He sat for a whole day to be examined. That I think he didn't have to do that. He could have invoked parliamentary privilege. There was another premier. There was questions about whether another premier would be examined. He was not examined, and I think that's very significant that our government gave access to the public to all of this, allowed itself to be questioned on its decision. I think that level of transparency is fundamental to our democracy.
So interesting, and I think gives a different perspective from perhaps what people took away from just what they read in the papers and what they watched on the news. So it strikes me that notwithstanding all the pressures on democracy, you have some degree of optimism about democracy. And so do you think there's and I'm going back to women here, and about the fact that you argued, and I think quite rightly, women are very diverse in their opinions and about how they will achieve both their own aspirations and their bigger goals. But is there a special place for women in the future of democracy, in rethinking it if we need to rethink it, or is it, where do women fit in that? And I think about that because there are so many instances in governments where, authoritarian governments, where women are excluded from decision making, where women are excluded from having that influence. Is there a particular place for women in thinking about the future of democracy?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I'm always interested about where are the women in the room. You give me a Supreme Court case, and I count the number of women who are counsel on it. I'm always interested in women's presence. Are they included? Are they excluded? because again, they give it, I don't think it's any different than inviting, regional representation, racial representation on all of these projects. You need these different perspectives. People come to the table with different perspectives and advocating for them, and the solutions become more robust. You are not able to sweep issues under the table. I think the judges, when there were 2 judges on the Supreme Court of Canada who were women, and then 3 and then 4, they talk about from their personal experience that questions that before were not raised or not discussed were brought to the forefront as a result of their presence. It's really about, you need to have this critical mass, I think, in order to affect change. And it allows people to raise issues that others may not see at all, not because they're necessarily, because they have ill will about it. They just don't know it.
It's not their experience.
It's not their experience.
Mm-hmm. Yes, exactly. Which then brings me back to some couple of final questions about you. How has being a woman influenced what you do, but also your career, and perhaps who you influence as well?
Well, I think it's, as I said, I think I'm very aware of my gender, and I'm always watching out for like how many women are in the room, how many are at hearings, how many are on a panel, what's going on. I think, and I feel like my generation, because I didn't have to fight to get in, I feel sort of that I'm in a position of privilege where I can call out issues or speak to issues much more directly without having a fear of retribution about it. And it also means that when I'm looking at younger lawyers, I'm thinking about who's in the room. I'm making sure that I'm being inclusive and I'm bringing people along. But I think you always, as a woman, you think about your tone, your appearance, all of those things. I think you always worry about, and I still worry that men have a lot more latitude in how they're able to present themselves, even in a professional environment, and women are a bit more constrained. But I think as I get older, as I mature through the profession, so part of my goals is to just try to wipe that away.
And that's such an interesting comment, because I can think in my own career ways in which dress or presentation and so on are so different for men and women in comparable positions, and the way in which we both change that, but also the way in which we try not to make that the sole focus, because you don't also want that to be the case.
Right. So
have you influenced, would you say, in the practice of law, the way in which you practice it, the way in which you engage in your professional environment, do you think you have a particular impact on women?
I would hope so. I would hope so. I think, I think for lawyers, we often say this to younger lawyers, you have to find your own voice and style. You're going to be mentored by lots of people. And, one lawyer is going to be very aggressive. One lawyer is going to be like this. You have to observe, but you have to find your own authentic voice. And I think, that is a constant work in progress. But I think trying to influence women to be able to be their authentic selves as professionals, and the way they speak in court, the way they cross-examine witnesses, to be respected for their craft, is very, very important.
Absolutely. So now turning back to the world, if we think about the future of democracy, and as you think about it, which you do, who do you look at, where do you look to see what the future, where things are coming or going?
I think I watch every election. I I was very heartened to see that in Poland, the kind of right-wing authoritarian government was defeated. And that was done in part in response to women of my mom's generation walking in the streets and saying, we're not going back. We're not going back. And I was heartened that in Hungary, Orban was also defeated. Like, I think it's like we sort of watch these things from election to election, but I think what it shows me is real civic action and real civic engagement is sort of critical and important for that to happen. And as I say, I think the alarm bells are ringing. I think we're not always maybe very forthright and honest about what the problems are that we need to address. And I think I'm worried that we sometimes think, oh, well, they're just attacking the lawyers, they're elites, it doesn't matter. Oh, they're just attacking the universities, they're fine. Oh, it's just the media, who cares, I have my Instagram. Like, I worry that there is an apathy. And I think, my message is they are not attacking those institutions randomly. Those institutions are critical to a functioning democracy, including lawyers. And you shouldn't, and lawyers and judges, criticizing judges' decisions, saying that the judges are too lax on criminals is it sounds like, oh, they're just disagreeing with the decision. But really, it's sort of a first step to undermining the judicial independence and a first step to making the majority feel like these people, the judges are not on your side. But the judges are not supposed to be on anyone's side. They're supposed to be upholding the Constitution.
What a great interview. Thank you very much for this conversation. It's been really, really fascinating.
Thank you, Charlotte.
Thanks for joining us.
Really appreciate having me. Thank you.